The bell above the mill door had not stopped ringing for 3 days, and Eleanor Whitcomb had not stopped moving with it. Steam rose from the carding room, women called numbers across the floor, and somewhere behind her, a wagon of raw wool groaned to a halt in the yard. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned toward the noise, and that was when she saw him standing in the doorway, like a storm that had wandered in by mistake. The Duke of Ashendale did not belong in a textile mill. His coat was too fine, his boots too clean, and his face wore the particular stillness of a man who expected the world to rearrange itself around him. Eleanor had seen that look before, on men who came to buy cheap cloth and leave without paying full price. She did not slow her steps. "You have wandered far from your card tables, Your Grace," she said, not unkindly, though she did not stop to curtsy either. "This is a working floor. Mind the belts." "I was told a woman runs this mill," he said, as though the fact itself offended him more than her tone. "I confess I expected someone older, or married." "I am neither," Eleanor said, and yet the looms still turn. A few of the workers nearest them had gone quiet, ears tuned the way workers' ears always are to trouble arriving in fine clothes. Eleanor felt their attention like heat on the back of her neck. She would not give them a spectacle. "My steward tells me your mill has taken half the labor from my own land," the Duke said. "Farm hands who ought to be working my fields are instead pulling your levers for wages I cannot match." "It is an inconvenience, madam." "It is not an inconvenience," Eleanor said. "It is a choice. Men choose to be paid on time." Something flickered across his face, there and gone, too fast for her to name. He recovered quickly, drawing himself up the way men of his kind always did when a woman had landed a blow too close to true. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carrying now, pitched for the benefit of anyone listening, "your time would be better spent with a needle in your hand than a ledger." "Stitching, madam, not scheming." The words hit the floor like a dropped shuttle, and for a moment, even the machines seemed to hush. Eleanor felt the sting of it, sharp and immediate, the old insult dressed up in new lace, a woman's place, a woman's proper work. She had heard it from her own uncle before he tried to sign her mill away to a man twice her age. She had heard it from bankers who preferred to speak to her foreman instead of her. She had built calluses against it, or so she believed, until this particular version landed in front of 40 of her own workers. She did not raise her voice. She let the silence stretch instead, long enough that the Duke's confidence began to waver at its edges, the way confidence always does when it is not immediately rewarded. "Shouldn't I be stitching?" she repeated softly, tasting the words. "Tell me, Your Grace, when did you last walk your own tenant farms?" "I walk them when it pleases me," he said, though something in his jaw had tightened. "Then it must please you rarely," Eleanor said, "because if you had walked them this month, you would have seen your own people lining up at my gate on payday. Not for cloth, for wages, because the rents you collect from them cannot be paid without the coin my mill puts in their pockets first." The Duke went very still. "That is not true," he said, but the words came out thinner than before. "Ask your steward," Eleanor said. "Ask Mr. Bellamy why half of Thornfield Village walks 2 miles to my gate every fortnight, instead of waiting on wages from your own estate, that never come. I did not seek to embarrass you, sir, but you have embarrassed yourself quite thoroughly enough for the both of us." A ripple went through the workers nearest them, quickly suppressed, the kind of silence that comes from people trying very hard not to smile. The Duke's eyes moved once around the floor, taking in the machines, the women at their stations, the ledgers stacked near the office door, as if seeing the place for the first time and finding it larger than he had imagined. "You overstep," he said finally, but there was no heat left in it, only the automatic reflex of a man unused to losing an argument in public. "I run a mill, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "Overstepping is rather the whole occupation." He left without another word, his boots striking hard against the wooden floor, and the door swung shut behind him, with more force than necessary. Eleanor watched him go, and felt her pulse settle only slowly, the way it always did, after a confrontation she had not chosen, but refused to lose. Beside her, her forewoman, a sturdy woman named Constance Hale who had worked the looms since she was 12, let out a low whistle. "Well," Constance said, "that will be spoken of in 3 villages by supper." "Let it be," Eleanor said, though her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. I have not lied about a single word of it. No, Constance agreed. But a duke does not enjoy being told the truth in front of an audience. Men like that remember who humbled them. Eleanor knew this. She had known it the moment the words left her mouth, and still she did not regret them. She had spent 6 years building this mill, from nothing but her father's small workshop and her own stubborn refusal to let it die with him. She had fought bankers who would not extend credit to a woman, fought suppliers who tried to cheat her on weight, fought her own uncle in a courtroom to keep the deed in her name rather than his. She had not survived all of that, only to stand quietly, while a duke suggested her proper place was behind a needle. Still, that night, alone in the small office above the mill floor, she allowed herself a moment of doubt. She sat with the ledger open before her, the numbers swimming slightly in the candlelight, and thought of the look on the duke's face when she had mentioned Thornfield Village. It had not been anger exactly. It had been something closer to shock, the expression of a man discovering a crack in a wall he had believed solid. She had meant to wound his pride. She had not expected to see genuine surprise beneath it. Eleanor closed the ledger and walked to the window. Below, the mill yard was quiet. The wagons stilled for the night, the great chimney breathing its last thin trail of smoke into the dark. Somewhere beyond the hills, past the river and the old stone bridge, lay Ashendale Hall, grand and cold, home to a man who apparently did not know his own tenants depended on the mill he had just insulted. It should not have troubled her. His ignorance was his own failing, not her concern. And yet she found herself wondering, as she banked the fire and prepared to leave, whether a man who did not know his own land could truly be as careless as his words suggested, or whether there was something else beneath the surface of Ashendale Hall that even its duke had not yet been told. The next morning brought her answer sooner than she expected, in the shape of a boy from Thornfield running full speed up the mill road, breathless, clutching a folded paper that had clearly traveled faster than good sense allowed. Eleanor took it from him at the gate, her name written across the front in a hand she recognized at once, as too fine, too careful, too deliberately controlled to belong to anyone but a man trying very hard not to seem rattled. She broke the seal and read. The Duke of Ashendale requested, in language stiff enough to have been carved from stone, a private audience with Miss Whitcomb at her earliest convenience, regarding a matter of some urgency concerning the tenants of Thornfield. Eleanor read it twice, then folded it slowly, aware of Constance watching her from across the yard with open curiosity. "He wants to see me," Eleanor said. "After yesterday?" Constance's eyebrows rose. "Either he means to apologize, or he means to ruin you, before you can embarrass him further." "Perhaps both," Eleanor said, though privately she suspected neither. There had been something in that brief flicker of shock on his face, something that did not match a man plotting revenge. It matched, if anything, a man who had just discovered his own house was built on ground he had never bothered to inspect. She folded the letter into her apron pocket and returned to the mill floor, to the looms and the ledgers and the 100 small decisions that kept 40 families fed. But some part of her mind stayed with the paper in her pocket for the rest of the day, turning over the Duke's words, his sudden stillness, the way his confidence had cracked not from her insult, but from the simple, undeniable fact beneath it. She did not yet know that the meeting he requested would change far more than either of them expected. She only knew, as she watched the sun sink behind Ashendale's distant hills that evening, that the man who had told her to go back to her stitching had walked away from the mill, not angry, but afraid. And fear, in a man like that, was rarely simple. It was, she suspected, only the beginning. The steward's name was Mr. Bellamy, and he stood now in the study at Ashendale Hall, with the look of a man who had spent the night composing an explanation, and had still not found one that satisfied him. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ashendale, sat behind his father's old desk with the estate ledgers spread before him. Pages he had not opened in longer than he cared to admit. "Explain it to me again," Edmund said, slowly. "There is little to explain differently, Your Grace," Bellamy said. "The rents from Thornfield have been arriving late for the better part of 2 years. Your father allowed it, believing the harvests would recover. They did not. The tenants have been making up the shortfall through outside wages, and for most of them, that means Miss Whitcomb's mill. And you did not think to tell me this." "I told your father, sir, repeatedly. He did not wish the matter raised with you until you had settled into the title. Edmund pressed his palm flat against the ledger, as though he might hold the numbers still by force. He had inherited the dukedom 8 months ago, in the wake of his father's sudden illness, and had spent most of those months learning the shape of a debt he had not known existed. He had assumed, foolishly it now seemed, that the estate's troubles began and ended with the roof repairs and the unpaid tradesmen in London. He had not imagined that the very tenants who owed him rent were being kept afloat by a mill he had walked into yesterday and mocked without a single fact to stand on. "Bring me the tenant accounts," Edmund said, "all of them, and send word to Miss Whitcomb that I wish to see her." "You already have, Your Grace. The boy left an hour ago." Edmund nodded, though the knot in his chest did not loosen. He remembered her face on the mill floor, the way she had not flinched, the way her words had landed with the precision of someone who had rehearsed nothing and needed to rehearse nothing, because every fact she spoke was already true. He had walked into that mill expecting to find disorder, a woman playing at a man's trade, something he could dismiss with a raised eyebrow and a clever remark. And he had found instead a floor of 40 workers who looked at her the way soldiers look at a competent officer, and a woman who had dismantled his pride in under 2 minutes without raising her voice once. He was not accustomed to losing an argument. He was even less accustomed to discovering, less than a day later, that he had been entirely wrong. Eleanor arrived at Ashendale Hall shortly before noon, dressed plainly, her hair pinned back without ornament, carrying herself the way she carried herself everywhere, as though she owed the building no particular deference. A footman led her to the study, where Edmund rose from behind the desk, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Miss Whitcomb," he said finally, "thank you for coming." "Your letter mentioned urgency," Eleanor said. "I assumed it would be rude to ignore it, however rude yesterday's conversation happened to be." A faint, reluctant twist touched the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "I deserve that." "You deserve considerably more than that, Your Grace, but I am told it is impolite to list a man's failings twice in 1 week. Sit, please." He gestured to the chair across from the desk, and when she had settled into it, he drew a slow breath, the kind a man takes before admitting something that costs him. "I spoke to my steward this morning. He confirmed what you told me yesterday. The Thornfield rents have been in arrears for 2 years. My father knew. I did not." "I am sorry for your father's illness," Eleanor said, and meant it, though her tone did not soften further than that. "But ignorance does not undo the insult you offered me in front of my own workers." "No," Edmund agreed. "It does not. I spoke without knowledge, and worse, I spoke with contempt I had no right to. That is not easily undone by an apology, but I intend to offer one regardless. I am sorry, Miss Whitcomb, sincerely." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. She had expected excuses, perhaps even veiled threats dressed as concern. She had not expected plain admission, delivered without flourish, from a man whose pride she had watched crack open on her own mill floor less than a day before. "Apology accepted," she said carefully. "Though I confess I am more curious about the urgency in your letter than the apology itself." Edmund nodded and pulled a ledger across the desk, turning it so she could see the columns of names, the rent figures marked in red where they had fallen short, the notations beside each one. Names she recognized, families whose wages she had signed for herself. "I need to understand my own estate," Edmund said, "and it seems I cannot do that without understanding your mill first. Half of Thornfield depends on wages you provide. If your mill were to fail, or if I were foolish enough to drive away the very labor keeping my tenants solvent, I would lose them both, the rents and the people. I am asking for your help, Miss Whitcomb, though I recognize I have no right to it after yesterday. You are asking me to explain my own business to the man who told me I belonged behind a needle." "Yes," Edmund said simply. "I am aware of how that sounds." Eleanor almost laughed, not from amusement, but from the sheer audacity of it, the strange turn the last day had taken. She looked down at the ledger, at the names of families she had watched line up at her gate every fortnight, families who worked her looms by day and tended his fields by whatever hours remained, stretched thin between 2 obligations that had never once, until this moment, been connected in the mind of the man who owned the land beneath them both. "Your tenants are not simply names in a column, Your Grace," she said. Mr. Headley has 6 children, and a wife recovering from a fever that nearly took her last winter. The Farrow family lost their eldest son to a fall from your own hayloft 2 summers ago, and your father sent no word of condolence, only a reminder that the rent was still due. If you wish to understand your estate, you will not find it in this ledger. You will find it in Thornfield itself, walking the roads you claimed yesterday to walk, whenever it pleased you. Edmund's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to shame, the particular discomfort of a man confronted with the gap between what he believed and what was true. Then take me there, he said. Today, if you are willing, show me what I have failed to see. Eleanor considered him for a long moment, weighing the request against everything she knew of men like him, men who apologized prettily and forgot just as easily once the discomfort passed. But there had been no prettiness in his apology. There had been only the flat, unadorned sound of a man realizing he had been wrong and choosing, however belatedly, to correct it. Very well, she said, but you will walk it as I walk it, Your Grace. No carriage, no footmen trailing behind to soften the ground beneath your boots. Agreed, Edmund said, and for the first time since she had met him, something like genuine respect passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable. They set out that afternoon along the road toward Thornfield, and Eleanor watched him carefully as the village came into view. The low cottages with their patched roofs, the children, who paused their games to stare at the sight of their landlord walking the same muddy road they walked every day. She watched him take it in, slowly, the way a man takes in a wound he has only just noticed on his own body. They passed the Headley cottage first, where a woman knelt in the small garden, pulling weeds from around a row of thin vegetables, her youngest child balanced on one hip. She rose when she saw them, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression caught between wariness and confusion, at the sight of the Duke on foot beside Eleanor. Mrs. Headley, Eleanor said gently. His Grace wished to see Thornfield for himself. The woman's eyes moved between them, uncertain, before settling on some careful, guarded politeness. Your Grace, she said, dropping a small curtsy. We manage well enough, sir. Thank you for asking. Do you? Edmund asked, and something in his voice made the woman glance up, surprised by the plainness of the question. I am told the rent has fallen behind these 2 years. I am told it is Miss Whitcomb's wages that have kept your family fed in that time, not mine. Mrs. Headley hesitated, clearly unsure whether honesty would cost her more than silence. Eleanor gave her a small nod, permission and reassurance both. It is true, sir, the woman admitted finally. My husband works the mill 3 days a week, and our eldest as well. Now she is old enough. Without that, I could not tell you how we would manage the winter. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, looking at the cottage, the thin vegetable rows, the child on the woman's hip watching him with wide, unafraid curiosity that only children possess in the presence of power they do not yet understand. Thank you for telling me, he said finally. It will not go unanswered. They continued through the village as the afternoon wore on, and at each cottage, the story repeated itself in small variations. Families stretched between insufficient rents and insufficient wages, patched together by Eleanor's mill, in ways Edmund had never troubled himself to notice. By the time they reached the edge of Thornfield, where the road curved back toward Ashendale, something in his bearing had changed, the easy arrogance of the previous day replaced by a quiet, grim attentiveness. I did not know, he said finally, more to himself than to her. I inherited all of this, and I did not know. Now you do, Eleanor said. The question is, what you intend to do with the knowledge. Edmund looked at her then, and there was nothing performative in his expression, none of the practiced charm she had expected from a man of his station, only the plain weight of responsibility settling onto shoulders that had not yet learned to carry it. I intend to fix it, he said, though I confess, I do not yet know how. That, Eleanor said, allowing herself the faintest trace of a smile, is at least a more honest answer than stitching. Edmund laughed, low and surprised, as though the sound had escaped before he could stop it, and for a moment, the tension between them eased into something almost companionable, something neither of them had expected when the day began. But even as they walked back toward the hall in the fading afternoon light, Eleanor noticed a rider watching them from the tree line near the crossroads, a man she did not recognize, mounted on a fine gray horse, his attention fixed a moment too long on the sight of the Duke and the mill owner walking together. He turned his horse and rode off, before she could see his face clearly, but the sight of him left an uneasy weight in her chest that lingered long after he had disappeared from view. She said nothing of it to Edmund, not yet, but she remembered the look of calculation in the rider's posture, the deliberate patience of a man taking note of something he intended to use, and she wondered, as she made her way back to the mill that evening, whether the trouble between herself and the Duke had only just begun, and whether it would prove far more dangerous than a public insult on a working room floor. The trouble arrived 3 days later, in the shape of a letter, delivered to the mill by a boy who did not know its contents, only that he had been paid well to carry it quickly. Eleanor read it standing at her office window, and the careful, oily politeness of its wording did nothing to soften the threat beneath. Sir Rowland Price owned the largest wool farms in 3 counties, and he had written to inform Miss Whitcomb that, effective at the end of the month, he would no longer be supplying raw wool to her mill. He offered no reason beyond a vague mention of more favorable arrangements elsewhere, though Eleanor did not need one spelled out. Sir Rowland's wool accounted for nearly half of what her looms required. Without it, production would slow within weeks and stop within 2 months. She sat with the letter a long while before she understood why the timing troubled her so deeply. It had come only 3 days after she and Edmund had walked the road through Thornfield together, 3 days after the rider on the gray horse had watched them from the tree line, with an expression she now understood far better than she had at the time. She sent word to Ashendale Hall that same afternoon, and Edmund arrived at the mill within the hour, his face already set with the particular grimness of a man who had suspected trouble before he had confirmation of it. "Sir Rowland?" he said, once she had shown him the letter. "I should have expected this." "You know him?" "Everyone in 3 counties knows him," Edmund said. "He has spent the better part of a year trying to arrange a match between his daughter and myself. My estate needs the dowry more than I care to admit, and Sir Rowland has never been shy about reminding me of it." Eleanor absorbed this slowly, feeling the shape of the trap close a little tighter around her understanding. "And he saw us together on the Thornfield Road. He saw enough, apparently, to decide that starving your mill would serve his purposes rather neatly," Edmund said. "If your business fails, my tenants lose their wages, my rents fall further behind, and I become considerably more desperate for exactly the kind of marriage he has been offering. So this is not truly about wool at all." "No," Edmund said. "It never was." Eleanor folded the letter carefully, though her hands were not as steady as she would have liked. She had built this mill against every obstacle a man like Sir Rowland could imagine: bankers who refused her credit, suppliers who tried to shortchange her, an uncle who had taken her to court rather than see a woman hold a deed in her own name. She had survived all of it. She did not intend to lose her mill now to a man's petty scheme to secure his daughter a title. "I will find another supplier," she said, more to herself than to him, already turning the problem over the way she turned over every crisis, searching for the seam where it could be pried open. "There is no other supplier of that scale within 2 days' travel," Edmund said. "I have seen the ledgers. Sir Rowland controls nearly all the wool production in this part of the county. It was not chance that he chose this particular weapon. Then I will find a smaller solution. Several smaller suppliers, if I must, even if it costs more to coordinate." "It will cost considerably more," Edmund said, "and take time you do not have, if your current stock runs out within the month." Eleanor turned to look at him, and something in his tone made her pause. There was no condescension in it, none of the careless certainty she had heard from him on the mill floor only days before. He spoke now as a man laying out a genuine problem to a partner capable of solving it, not as a man explaining the world to a woman who could not be expected to understand it. "You have a suggestion," she said. "I have an idea," Edmund said. "Whether it qualifies as a suggestion depends on whether you are willing to hear it from me, given how badly I began this acquaintance. Say it anyway. My own lands produce wool as well, though not at the scale of Sir Rowland's farms. It has always gone to market through agents in London, sold at whatever price the season allows. If I redirected that supply to your mill instead, at a fair price, it would not replace everything Sir Rowland withdraws, but it would buy you time. Enough, perhaps, to secure smaller suppliers elsewhere, without your looms falling silent in the meantime." Eleanor considered this carefully, turning the offer over for hidden costs, the way she turned over every arrangement that seemed too convenient. Why would you do this? It ties your own estate's fortunes to my mill's survival, and gives Sir Roland every reason to see us both as allies against him. Because we already are allies against him, whether either of us intended it, Edmund said. He has made that clear enough with this letter. And because, Miss Whitcomb, I find I would rather be useful to you than have been the cause, even indirectly, of losing everything you built. There was a quiet honesty in the way he said it, unpolished, without the practiced charm she had come to expect from men of his class when they wanted something. Eleanor studied him a long moment, weighing the offer against the risk of trusting a man she had known for less than a week, a man whose own pride had needed correcting the very first time they met. Very well, she said finally. We will try it. But I want the arrangement in writing, Your Grace, with terms we both agree upon, before a single bale of wool crosses from your land to mine. I have learned, at considerable cost, not to rely on a gentleman's word alone. A fair condition, Edmund said, and something in his expression suggested he did not resent it, only respected the caution that had earned it. They spent the following days working out the arrangement in careful detail, meeting each morning in the small mill office, poring over figures and delivery schedules, the practical mechanics of moving wool from Ashendale's fields to Eleanor's looms, without disrupting either the estate's other obligations or the mill's production schedule. It was, in its way, the strangest courtship Eleanor could have imagined, built not on flowers or flattery, but on shipping weights and fair pricing. And yet she found herself, somewhere in the third day of negotiations, no longer bracing for condescension every time he spoke. He listened when she explained the mill's operations, asked questions rather than assuming answers, adjusted his own suggestions when she pointed out flaws he had not considered. It was such a small thing, being heard, and yet Eleanor realized with some discomfort how rarely she had experienced it from a man of his standing. You are surprised, Edmund observed one afternoon, catching the look on her face as she reviewed a revised delivery schedule he had drafted overnight, incorporating 3 changes she had suggested the previous day, without complaint. I am unaccustomed to being agreed with, Eleanor admitted. Most men in your position prefer to be right, even when they are not. I have discovered, rather recently and rather painfully, the cost of preferring to be right over being correct, Edmund said. It is not a mistake I intend to repeat, particularly not with you. The remark carried more weight than its casual delivery suggested, and Eleanor felt it settle somewhere she had not expected, a warmth she recognized with some alarm, as something closer to affection than mere professional respect. She busied herself with the ledger to avoid meeting his eyes, uncertain what to do with the feeling or whether she trusted it yet. The arrangement, once finalized, bought her exactly the breathing room Edmund had promised. Ashendale's wool began arriving at the mill within the week, and Eleanor sent riders to 3 smaller wool farms in neighboring counties, securing partial contracts that, combined with Edmund's supply, kept her looms running without interruption. It was not a perfect solution, and the costs of coordinating so many smaller arrangements ate into margins she would have preferred to keep intact, but the mill survived, and Sir Roland's scheme, whatever its intended effect, had failed to strangle her business, as he had clearly hoped. Word of the arrangement reached Sir Roland faster than Eleanor expected, and his response arrived not as another letter, but as the man himself, riding up to the mill gate one gray afternoon, with an expression of carefully controlled displeasure. Miss Whitcomb, he said, dismounting without invitation, I see you have found other means of supply. Resourceful of you. I manage, Sir Roland, Eleanor said, as I always have. With the Duke's assistance, I am told. His eyes moved over her, with an assessment she did not care for, calculating and cold. How fortunate for you, that he took such a personal interest in your affairs. His Grace's affairs are his own business, Eleanor said, as mine are mine. Are they? Sir Roland's smile did not reach his eyes. I wonder if the Duke's tenants would agree, given how thoroughly your mill has entangled itself in matters that once belonged solely to Ashendale. Some might call it ambition. Others might call it something considerably less flattering. And what would you call it, Sir Roland? I would call it, he said, a woman who has forgotten her place, propped up by a young duke, too foolish to see how he is being used. But that is only my opinion, Miss Whitcomb. I am sure others will form their own, once the matter becomes more widely known. The threat was not subtle, and Eleanor understood it immediately for what it was. Not merely an attempt to starve her mill of wool, but a warning that Sir Rowland intended to attack her reputation next, to paint her partnership with Edmund as something scandalous rather than practical, something that would cost her the respect of the very community she had spent years earning. Say what you have come to say plainly, Sir Rowland, Eleanor said. I have little patience for riddles dressed as courtesy. Very well, he said, his pleasant mask slipping just enough to show the calculation beneath it. End this arrangement with the Duke, return to your mill's ordinary business, and I will restore your wool supply at the original terms. No harm done. Continue as you are, and I promise you, Miss Whitcomb, the damage to your reputation will outlast any profit this partnership brings you. Eleanor held his gaze without flinching, though inwardly she felt the full weight of what he was threatening, not merely her livelihood now, but her name, the careful respectability she had built to protect herself from exactly this kind of attack. I will consider your offer, she said, giving nothing away, and give you my answer when I am ready, not before. Sir Rowland's jaw tightened at the refusal to be rushed, but he said nothing further, only mounted his horse and rode away without a backward glance, leaving Eleanor standing in the mill yard, with the unpleasant certainty that the conflict between them had only just begun, and that Edmund, whether he realized it yet or not, had just been drawn fully into the middle of it. Eleanor did not tell Edmund of Sir Rowland's visit immediately. She told herself it was because the mill demanded her attention, 3 new supply contracts to finalize, and a broken loom in the weaving room that had cost half a day's production. But the truth, when she allowed herself to examine it, was simpler and less comfortable. She did not yet know what she wanted to do about the threat, and she did not wish to hand the decision to him before she had made it herself. It was Constance who finally pressed the matter, 2 days later, catching Eleanor alone in the office long after the mill floor had gone quiet for the evening. You have not been yourself since Sir Rowland's visit, Constance said, setting down a cup of tea Eleanor had not asked for, but accepted gratefully all the same. Whatever he said to you, it is sitting on you like a stone. He threatened my reputation, Eleanor said finally, because there was little use hiding it from a woman who had watched her build this mill from its first crooked beam. He believes my arrangement with the Duke will be seen as improper, and he intends to see that belief spread, unless I end the partnership. And will you? I have not decided. Constance studied her for a long moment, the particular look of a woman who had known Eleanor long enough to see past her careful composure. You have not decided, she repeated, or you do not wish to admit what you have already decided, because the reason frightens you more than Sir Rowland does. Eleanor said nothing, and Constance, wise enough not to push further, only patted her shoulder and left her to the silence of the office, the ledgers, and the truth she was not yet ready to name. She told Edmund the following morning, when he arrived for their usual review of the delivery schedule, laying out Sir Rowland's threat plainly and watching his face carefully for the reaction. She expected concern, perhaps guilt, given that his own arrangement had provoked the threat in the first place. She did not expect the flash of quiet fury that crossed his features, controlled but unmistakable. He threatened your name, Edmund said, to force you into abandoning an arrangement that has kept your mill running and my tenants fed. That is not merely petty, Miss Whitcomb. That is contemptible. It is also effective, Eleanor said. Reputation is not a small thing for a woman in my position. I have spent years building respectability enough to be taken seriously in rooms full of men who would otherwise dismiss me entirely. Sir Rowland knows precisely how to threaten that. Then we end the arrangement, Edmund said, though the words came out reluctantly, as though he disliked them even as he spoke them. If continuing costs you your name, I will not ask you to pay that price for my tenants' sake. I did not say I intended to end it, Eleanor said, surprising herself slightly with the firmness in her own voice. I said he threatened it. There is a difference, Your Grace, between a threat and a decision. Something shifted in Edmund's expression, relief mixed with an admiration he did not bother to hide. You mean to stand against him? I mean to decide for myself what my mill does and does not do, Eleanor said. I have not spent 6 years building this business, only to hand control of it to a man's petty scheme the moment he raises his voice. Sir Roland can spread whatever rumors he pleases. I will not give him the satisfaction of seeing me retreat." "Then you will not stand against him alone," Edmund said. "Whatever comes of this, I intend to see it through with you, not merely as a business arrangement, but because it is the right thing to do, and because—" He paused, as though the next words cost him something to say aloud. "Because I have come to value your company, rather more than I expected to, Miss Whitcomb. And I find I do not wish to lose it over Sir Roland's schemes." The admission hung in the air between them, unguarded in a way neither of them had allowed themselves to be since the first, disastrous meeting on the mill floor. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, an awareness she had been carefully avoiding for days now rising to the surface, despite her best efforts to keep it buried beneath practical concerns. "Your Grace," she began, uncertain how to answer something she had not permitted herself to examine too closely. "Edmund," he said, "if we are to weather Sir Roland's schemes together, I would rather you use my name than my title, at least when we are not standing in front of an audience prepared to gossip about it." "Edmund," she repeated, testing the shape of it, and something in his expression softened at the sound of it in her voice. They worked through the rest of the morning, with a new awareness, humming quietly, beneath their usual practical exchanges. Glances held a moment too long, a warmth in his voice, when he addressed her, that had not been there in their earlier meetings. Neither of them spoke of it directly, both too cautious, too aware of what such an admission would mean, given the difference in their stations, and the storm Sir Roland was already threatening to raise around them. The storm arrived faster than either of them expected. Within a week, whispers had begun circulating through the county, carried by the particular efficiency with which scandal travels through small communities, that the Duke of Ashendale had taken an improper interest in the mill owner, that his sudden generosity toward her business was not the act of a responsible landlord, but the indiscretion of a man led astray by a woman, with ambitions beyond her station. Eleanor heard the rumors second-hand, through Constance, through the wary glances of women at the market who had once greeted her warmly, through the pointed silence of a banker who had previously treated her with grudging respect. It reached its worst the following Sunday, at church, when Eleanor arrived to find the usual polite nods replaced by something colder, several of the wealthier families making a visible show of distancing themselves as she passed, whispers following in her wake that she was too well trained to acknowledge, but could not entirely ignore either. Edmund found her afterward, standing alone near the churchyard wall, her composure carefully held but her eyes betraying the hurt she would not otherwise have admitted. "This is my doing," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I should have been more careful. I did not consider how quickly Sir Roland's poison would spread, or how much of the cost would fall on you rather than me. The world rarely divides its costs fairly between a duke and a mill owner," Eleanor said, with more bitterness than she intended to show. "You will weather a season of gossip and emerge with your reputation largely intact. I may not be so fortunate." "Then let me correct that," Edmund said, and something in his tone made her turn to look at him fully. "Let me make it plain, publicly, that this arrangement was born of necessity and respect, not indiscretion. I will not stand by and let Sir Roland's lies cost you everything you have built. Not when the fault, if there is fault to assign, lies with my own carelessness in walking into your mill and insulting you before I understood a single fact of your situation," Eleanor asked. "A public denial will only fuel the gossip further. Men in your position rarely improve matters by insisting too loudly that there is nothing to see." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, more careful, more deliberate. "There is one correction that would settle the matter beyond doubt, though I understand it is neither simple nor something to propose lightly, given everything Sir Roland has already made of our association." Eleanor understood his meaning before he finished the thought, and felt her breath catch at the implication of it, the sheer scale of what he was suggesting. "Edmund," she said carefully, "you cannot mean marriage as a solution to a rumor." "I do not mean it as a solution to a rumor," he said. "I mean it because I have found myself, over these past weeks, admiring you more than I have admired any woman in my acquaintance, for your strength, your honesty, the fierce loyalty you show your workers, and now, apparently, my own tenants as well. If the rumor happens to align with a truth I had not yet found the courage to speak, I see no reason to let Sir Roland's scheming be the only voice heard on the matter." Eleanor stood very still, the churchyard around them fading into irrelevance, aware of nothing but the steady, unguarded honesty in his expression, the absence of any calculation or convenience in the way he had spoken. It was not the declaration she had expected, not from a man who had mocked her so thoroughly at their first meeting, and yet it fit, somehow, with everything she had come to know of him since, the willingness to admit fault, the steady respect he had shown her judgment in every decision since, the quiet fury he had felt on her behalf when Sir Roland threatened her name. "This is not a decision to make in a churchyard, with half the county watching," she said finally, though there was no rejection in her tone, only caution. "No," Edmund agreed, "it is not. But I wished you to know my mind, Eleanor, before Sir Roland's schemes force either of us into a decision we have not made freely." Before she could answer further, a voice called out from across the churchyard, sharp and deliberately loud enough to carry, and Eleanor turned to see Sir Roland himself approaching, his daughter Isabel at his side, her expression carefully arranged into something between curiosity and satisfaction, as though she had been sent specifically to witness whatever unfolded next. "Your Grace," Sir Roland said, his voice pitched for the benefit of the small crowd still lingering near the church doors. "How fortunate to find you here, engaged in such earnest conversation with Miss Whitcomb. I do hope I am not interrupting anything of significance." The deliberate cruelty of the timing was not lost on Eleanor, and she felt the weight of every eye in the churchyard turned toward them, waiting to see how the moment would resolve, whether it would confirm every rumor Sir Roland had already spread, or offer some new scandal for the county to feast upon in the weeks ahead. Edmund did not flinch from the interruption, though Eleanor felt the tension gather in him like a drawn bowstring. "Sir Roland," he said, his voice even, deliberately calm, "you are not interrupting anything improper, if that is your implication. Miss Whitcomb and I were discussing the terms of our continued arrangement, which I intend to see through, regardless of whatever gossip you have chosen to spread this past week." "Gossip," Sir Roland repeated, his smile thin. "I have spread nothing, Your Grace, beyond simple observation. It is the county itself that has drawn its own conclusions, watching a duke abandon every sensible consideration of station and reputation to align himself so closely with a tradeswoman." Isabel Price, standing a step behind her father, allowed a small, satisfied smile to cross her face, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough for Eleanor to miss it. It confirmed what Eleanor had already suspected, that this confrontation had been planned, timed deliberately to catch them together, and force a public reckoning on Sir Roland's terms, rather than their own. "A tradeswoman," Edmund said, "who has kept half your own former tenants fed through wages you were never generous enough to offer them yourself, Sir Roland, and whose mill has outperformed every estimate placed upon it since the day she inherited it, against odds you cannot begin to imagine. If the county wishes to judge my character for admiring competence and integrity over idle title, I find I have very little concern for its verdict." A murmur rippled through the small crowd still gathered near the churchyard gate, and Eleanor saw, with some surprise, that not all of it carried disapproval. Several faces, women she recognized from the market, from years of quiet transactions, and small kindnesses, exchanged across her mill's counter, wore expressions closer to sympathy than scorn. But Sir Roland was not finished. "Fine words, Your Grace, though I wonder how well they will hold once your creditors in London learn that the Duke of Ashendale has chosen to entangle his failing estate further, with a mill that could collapse the moment its owner's reputation is sufficiently ruined. I have connections in London as well, sir. It would take very little effort to ensure your lenders hear a rather less flattering account of this arrangement than the one you have just offered." The threat landed with visible weight, and Eleanor saw something tighten in Edmund's expression, the recognition of a danger far more concrete than mere gossip. His estate's debts were real, and creditors, unlike neighbors, cared nothing for character or integrity, only for the appearance of stability and the likelihood of repayment. A scandal loud enough to reach London could accelerate demands he was not yet prepared to meet. "You would ruin an entire estate, and every tenant depending upon it, out of spite for a rejected marriage proposal," Edmund said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. "I would ensure my daughter's future is not squandered on a duke too foolish to secure his own finances sensibly," Sir Roland said. "Consider it a lesson in consequences, Your Grace. You may end this arrangement with Miss Whitcomb now, quietly, and I will see that no further word travels to London. Or you may continue, and discover exactly how quickly a struggling estate can collapse once its creditors lose confidence entirely. Eleanor watched Edmund's jaw work silently, the calculation visible behind his eyes, the terrible weight of a choice that was not truly his alone to make. Not when tenants and servants and an entire estate's future hung in the balance alongside her own mill. She felt something cold settle in her chest, the old, familiar fear that any partnership with a man of his station would eventually demand exactly this sacrifice. Her interests weighed against greater obligations, and found wanting. "Do not answer him now," she said quietly, before Edmund could speak. "Not here, not with half the county watching for exactly this moment." Sir Rowland's smile widened slightly, as though her intervention only confirmed his satisfaction with the scene he had orchestrated. "Wise counsel, Miss Whitcomb. Perhaps there is more sense in you than I credited." He inclined his head toward Edmund. "Consider my offer, Your Grace. I will expect your answer within the week." He turned and walked away, Isabel following, with one last, lingering glance toward Eleanor. Not triumphant exactly, but calculating, the look of a woman assessing whether her father's scheme had achieved its purpose. The crowd dispersed slowly in their wake, and Eleanor became aware, gradually, of the silence stretching between herself and Edmund, heavier now than anything Sir Rowland's threats had managed to create directly. "I will not let him force this," Edmund said finally. "Whatever the cost to my estate, I will not abandon this arrangement, or you, simply because a bitter man threatens my creditors." "You may not have the choice," Eleanor said, and the words cost her more than she expected them to. "I have watched men lose everything to creditors who called in debts at the worst possible moment. Edmund, your tenants, the very families we walked among together, would suffer first and worst if your estate collapsed entirely. I will not be the cause of that, whatever it costs me personally." "Eleanor, I mean it," she said, more firmly now, though her voice trembled slightly at the edges. "Perhaps it is best if we step back from this arrangement, at least publicly, until the situation with Sir Rowland resolves itself one way or another. I have weathered difficulty before. I will weather this as well." Edmund looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, frustration and something closer to hurt tangled together. "You would step back not because you believe it is wrong, but because you believe it is safer for me. That is not partnership, Eleanor. That is exactly the sacrifice you claim to refuse making on my behalf." The observation struck closer to truth than Eleanor cared to admit, and she found she had no immediate answer for it, only the tangled mess of fear and pride and genuine care that had brought her to this moment, uncertain which impulse to trust. "I need time to think," she said finally, "away from Sir Rowland's threats, away from the churchyard, away from everything except my own judgment." "Then take it," Edmund said, though the words carried a weariness that had not been there before. "But do not mistake retreat for wisdom, Eleanor. Sometimes the safest choice is only the choice that costs us the most in the end." He left her standing alone near the churchyard wall, and Eleanor watched him go with a hollow ache settling in her chest, uncertain whether she had just protected something precious or thrown it away out of fear disguised as caution. The days that followed brought no relief. Sir Rowland's threat hung over both of them, unresolved, and the county's gossip continued, regardless of whether Eleanor and Edmund appeared together or apart, feeding on itself in the particular way rumors do when starved of fresh confirmation. Worse, Eleanor learned through a nervous letter from one of her smaller wool suppliers that Sir Rowland's influence had begun reaching beyond Ashendale's borders, quietly discouraging two of the farms she had contracted with from continuing their arrangements, citing vague concerns about the mill's stability. It was, Eleanor realized with mounting dread, precisely the slow strangulation Sir Rowland had first attempted openly, now pursued more carefully, more patiently, exploiting the distance she herself had created between her mill and Edmund's support. She sat alone in her office late one evening, the ledgers spread before her showing losses she had not anticipated even a month before, and allowed herself, finally, to examine the full weight of what her caution had cost. She had stepped back to protect Edmund's estate, and in doing so, had left her own mill more vulnerable than if she had simply stood beside him and weathered Sir Rowland's threats together, as partners rather than as two isolated targets, easier to pick off separately. Constance found her there past midnight. The candle burned low. Eleanor's face drawn with an exhaustion that had little to do with the hour. "You have made a mistake," Constance said, without preamble, settling into the chair across from the desk. "I have watched you build this mill, through every hardship a woman in your position could face, and I have never once seen you retreat from a fight you believed was worth winning. Until now." "I was trying to protect him," Eleanor said. "His tenants, his estate. And in doing so, you handed Sir Roland exactly what he wanted," Constance said. "Divide you first, and then defeat you separately. You know this strategy, Eleanor. You have used it yourself, in negotiations, in every difficult contract you have ever secured. Why did you not recognize it when it was used against you?" Eleanor had no answer that did not sound like fear dressed as wisdom, and she sat in the heavy silence of her own office, surrounded by the numbers that confirmed exactly how much her caution had cost, and began, slowly, to understand what she needed to do next. Eleanor rode to Ashendale Hall the following morning, before her courage could cool into second thoughts, and found Edmund in the study, the same room where he had first shown her the tenant ledgers, though he looked considerably more worn now than he had that day, the weight of Sir Roland's threat visible in the shadows beneath his eyes. "I was wrong," she said, before he could offer any greeting at all. "I stepped back believing I was protecting you, and instead, I handed Sir Roland exactly the victory he wanted. I have spent the past days watching my own suppliers grow nervous, watching the very isolation I created weaken us both rather than strengthen either. I will not make that mistake again." Edmund rose from behind the desk slowly, something cautious and hopeful moving across his features in equal measure. "What are you proposing?" "That we stop letting Sir Roland dictate the terms of this fight," Eleanor said. "He has attacked us separately, because together, we are considerably harder to defeat. Your estate needs stability. My mill needs supply security. Neither of us achieves either by retreating from the other out of fear of what the county might whisper. And Sir Roland's threat to my creditors? Creditors care about repayment, not scandal, Eleanor said. If your estate can demonstrate genuine growing stability, an alliance that strengthens both the land and the mill rather than draining either, there is very little Sir Roland can whisper in London that will outweigh solid figures showing your debts being addressed rather than deepened. Edmund considered this, and Eleanor watched the calculation move behind his eyes, the same careful attention he had shown throughout every negotiation they had conducted together, weighing risk against opportunity, with a clarity that had not been present in him the day she first met him. "You would need to formalize the wool arrangement," he said slowly, "not as a quiet accommodation between neighbors, but as a genuine, public partnership. Contracts filed properly, terms visible to anyone who cared to examine them. It would remove any suggestion of impropriety, replacing gossip with plain business fact." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And you would need to address the tenant rents directly, publicly, showing the county, and any creditor watching, that Ashendale's finances are being managed with genuine care rather than neglect. Sir Roland's threats only carry weight if there is real vulnerability beneath them. Remove the vulnerability, and the threats become empty noise." "It is a considerable undertaking," Edmund said, though there was something like relief in his voice now, the particular relief of a man handed a genuine solution after days of feeling trapped between impossible choices. "But I believe you are right. I have spent too long reacting to Sir Roland's schemes rather than building something solid enough to withstand them." They spent the following 2 weeks in careful, deliberate work, Eleanor drafting formal supply contracts with her solicitor's guidance, Edmund meeting with his own creditors in person rather than through correspondence, laying out a genuine plan for rent recovery built on the stability the mill partnership provided. It was exhausting work, meticulous and unglamorous, entirely unlike the dramatic gestures Eleanor might once have imagined would resolve such a conflict, and yet, she found a particular satisfaction in it, the sense of building something that could not easily be dismantled by rumor or spite. Sir Roland did not remain idle during those weeks. Reports reached Eleanor of further attempts to discourage her smaller suppliers, of letters sent to London hinting at instability in Ashendale's finances, of careful, poisonous conversations at dinner tables throughout the county, designed to keep the scandal alive. But each attempt found less purchase than the last, as the formal contracts became public record, as Ashendale's creditors began receiving genuine payments rather than excuses, as the mill's production not only stabilized but grew, absorbing two of the smaller wool farms Sir Roland had tried to frighten away entirely. The final confrontation came not at a churchyard or a mill floor, but at the county assembly, the same kind of gathering where Edmund had first mocked her, months before, in front of an audience prepared to judge. Sir Roland arrived with Isabel at his side once more, though his confidence had visibly thinned in the weeks since the wedding of contracts and creditors had begun eroding the foundation of his scheme. "Your Grace," Sir Roland said, approaching with the same careful, public volume he had used before. "I confess surprise to see you still so entangled with Miss Whitcomb's affairs. I had rather hoped my earlier counsel would have persuaded you toward wiser arrangements." "Your counsel, Sir Roland, was never wisdom," Edmund said, his voice carrying easily across the assembly room, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "It was extortion, dressed in polite language, an attempt to force my hand through threats to my tenants, my creditors, and Miss Whitcomb's reputation. I am pleased to inform you that it has failed entirely." A ripple of interested murmurs moved through the room, and Sir Roland's expression tightened, the mask of pleasant condescension slipping to reveal something considerably more brittle beneath. "Failed," he repeated. "Your creditors would disagree, I think, once they learn the full extent of your finances." "My creditors," Edmund said, "have already received full accounting of Ashendale's finances, including the formal partnership with Whitcomb Mill that has stabilized my tenant rents for the first time in 3 years. I met with them myself, in London, a fortnight ago. They were, I am pleased to say, considerably more impressed by demonstrated stability than by whatever whispers you have been sending ahead of me." Eleanor watched Sir Roland's composure crack further, the particular desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed scheme collapse in front of the very audience he had hoped would witness his triumph instead. "And you, Miss Whitcomb," Sir Roland said, turning toward her with something almost pleading beneath the anger now, "surely you understand the damage this arrangement continues to do to your reputation, regardless of contracts and creditors." "My reputation, Sir Roland, has survived considerably worse than gossip from a man who tried to starve my mill of wool because his daughter's marriage prospects mattered more to him than the well-being of an entire village's tenants," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry through the room without effort. "I built this mill against every obstacle placed before me, including men exactly like you, and I do not intend to let your spite undo years of honest work now." The room had gone fully quiet, every face turned toward the unfolding scene, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since Sir Roland's initial threat, the genuine possibility that this confrontation would end, not in her defeat, but in his. "You have both made your positions clear," Sir Roland said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "I wish you joy of each other, and of whatever consequences follow from such an unconventional arrangement." He turned and left the assembly room, with Isabel trailing behind him, and the silence he left in his wake slowly gave way to a low hum of conversation, considerably more curious than condemning now, the particular shift in tone that comes when a community begins to sense which way genuine opinion is turning. Edmund turned to Eleanor once the room's attention had shifted elsewhere, and something in his expression carried the same unguarded honesty she had seen in the churchyard weeks before, though steadier now, more certain. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "forever doubting that standing beside you was the wiser course." "You owe me nothing," Eleanor said. "We built this together, Edmund. The contracts, the creditor accounting, all of it. I could not have managed Sir Roland's scheme alone, any more than you could have managed your estate's recovery without the mill's stability behind it." "Then let us continue building together," Edmund said, "not merely as business partners weathering a shared threat, but as something considerably more permanent, if you are willing." "I meant what I said in the churchyard, Eleanor. My admiration for you was never merely convenient timing against Sir Roland's schemes. It was, and remains, entirely genuine." Eleanor felt the warmth of the assembly room recede around her, aware of nothing but the steady sincerity in his voice, the same honesty that had first surprised her the day he admitted his ignorance of Thornfield's suffering, and asked, plainly, for her help in correcting it. "I have spent 6 years refusing to let any man dictate the terms of my life," she said slowly, "and I find, rather to my own surprise, that I do not feel diminished at the thought of building a future alongside you, Edmund, only strengthened by it." "Is that a yes?" he asked, something like hope breaking through his careful composure. "It is a yes," Eleanor said, and allowed herself, finally, the small, genuine smile she had been guarding since the day he first walked into her mill and told her she ought to be stitching instead of running it. Their marriage, when it came that autumn, was a quiet affair by the standards of the county's gentry, held at Thornfield itself rather than the grand chapel at Ashendale Hall, attended by mill workers and tenant families alike, a deliberate choice that spoke plainly of the partnership at its foundation. Sir Rowland did not attend, though word reached them eventually that his own finances had suffered considerably once his reputation for petty scheming became more widely known among the very creditors and merchants he had once used to threaten others. The mill continued to grow in the years that followed, its production stabilized by Ashendale's wool and by the careful, formal partnerships Eleanor had built in the wake of Sir Rowland's failed scheme, while Thornfield's tenants found their rents finally kept pace with wages that no longer needed to compensate for a landlord's neglect. Edmund walked those roads often now, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care, greeting families by name, aware at last of the full weight and responsibility his title carried. And when, years later, a young woman new to the county heard the old story of the Duke who had mocked a mill owner only to marry her, she asked Eleanor herself whether the insult had truly stung as badly as legend suggested. "It stung considerably," Eleanor told her, with the faint, knowing smile of a woman who had long since made peace with how the story began. "But the sting taught him something no flattery ever could have. And in the end, my dear, it was never the stitching that built anything worth having. It was the willingness to stand firm, and the courage, eventually, to build something together." 5 years passed before the true test of what they had built arrived, not from Sir Rowland, whose influence had long since faded into county memory, but from a bitter winter that struck the whole region without warning, freezing the river that powered half the mill's machinery and burying the roads to Thornfield under snow too deep for wagons to pass. Eleanor stood at the mill window that first morning, watching ice creep along the mill race, and felt an old, familiar dread rise in her chest. The fear of losses she could not control, of workers left without wages through no fault of her own. The looms depended on the water wheel, and the water wheel depended on a river that had, overnight, turned to solid ice from bank to bank. Edmund arrived within the hour, having ridden through drifts that reached his horse's knees, his coat dusted white, his expression already turning towards solutions rather than despair. "The eastern barn at Ashendale still has the old horse-driven mechanism from my grandfather's time," he said, before Eleanor had even finished explaining the crisis. "It is slow, and it will not match the river's power, but it can keep at least half the looms turning while we wait for a thaw. I will have it brought down before nightfall." "That will not be enough to pay full wages," Eleanor said, already calculating losses in her head, the particular arithmetic of a woman who had spent a decade learning to survive on narrow margins. "Then we pay partial wages from the estate's reserves until the thaw comes," Edmund said, "and call it an investment in workers we cannot afford to lose to hunger or to other mills once the road's clear. We have weathered worse than a frozen river, Eleanor. We built this partnership precisely for winters like this one." It was, Eleanor reflected later, watching the horse-driven mechanism creak into motion in the mill's east wing, exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous solution that had defined their marriage from its earliest days. No grand romantic gestures, only steady problem-solving, offered without hesitation the moment trouble appeared. She had married a man who once told her she belonged behind a needle, and found instead a partner who rode through snowdrifts before breakfast to keep her workers fed. The thaw, when it finally came 3 weeks later, revealed a mill diminished in profit, but not in spirit, its workers grateful rather than resentful, its reputation in the county stronger for having weathered hardship with visible care rather than callous indifference. Word of the arrangement, the Duke who paid his tenants through the worst of winter rather than let them starve, spread through the county with considerably more warmth than Sir Rowland's old rumors ever had. That spring brought a different kind of test, gentler but no less significant, when Eleanor discovered she was carrying their first child. She told Edmund in the same office where they had first negotiated the wool contracts years before, watching his careful composure dissolve into something unguarded and joyful, in a way she had rarely seen from him. "A child," he said, as though testing the word for its full weight. "Eleanor, this changes everything." "It changes some things," Eleanor said, allowing herself the small, private smile she reserved only for him now. "It does not change the mill, or my place in it. I intend to keep running Whitcomb's floor as long as I am able, child or no child." "I would not dream of suggesting otherwise," Edmund said, and meant it fully. The old assumptions that had once led him to insult her on that very mill floor, now entirely absent from his voice. Their daughter was born that autumn, in the same season they had married, and Eleanor watched Edmund carry the child through Thornfield within her first month, introducing her to tenant families, who had known him only as a distant, careless landlord, before Eleanor herself had forced him to walk those same roads and see what he had never troubled himself to notice. Constance, older now but no less sharp-tongued, remarked once that the county had never seen a duke so thoroughly reformed by a single conversation on a mill floor, and Eleanor, holding her daughter while the looms turned steadily behind her, found she could not entirely disagree. "He was insufferable that first day," Eleanor admitted, watching Edmund cross the yard below, deep in conversation with a tenant farmer about the coming harvest. "I do not think I have ever wanted to strike a man so thoroughly as I wanted to strike him, standing there telling me I ought to be stitching." "And now?" Constance asked, amused. "Now," Eleanor said, "I think perhaps that insult was the finest thing that ever happened to this mill, however little either of us intended it that way. It forced a reckoning neither of us knew we needed, his with his own estate, and mine with how much I had let old wounds convince me that partnership always meant losing something of myself." The mill continued its steady growth over the following years, its wool arrangement with Ashendale becoming a model other estates in the county began, cautiously, to imitate, tenant wages and mill wages woven together in ways that strengthened both rather than pitting one against the other. Sir Rowland's name faded gradually from local conversation. His own fortunes diminished, not by any single act of revenge, but by the slow, natural consequence of a reputation built on cruelty rather than substance. And on quiet evenings, when the looms had gone still and the mill yard settled into darkness, Eleanor would sometimes find Edmund waiting for her at the gate, exactly as he had begun doing in those early, uncertain weeks of their partnership, and walk home beside him, along the same road that had once carried him toward Thornfield, in humbled silence, now carrying them both toward a life neither had expected, but both had chosen, deliberately and completely, to build together. The old insult was spoken of rarely now, except as the county's favorite story, told at gatherings, and passed down through Thornfield's families, as proof that even the proudest beginnings could soften into something worth remembering fondly. "Shouldn't you be stitching?" he had asked her, meaning it as dismissal, and she had answered, in the years that followed, with a mill that fed a village, a marriage built on genuine partnership rather than convenience, and a life neither of them would have traded for all the quiet stitching in England.